Hello, everyone. This is John McDonald with my lovely co-star Magnus. Hi, Magnus.
Hello.
Hi.
How British was that?
Yes, no, that
Hello.
was great. Hello. The only thing that would make that more British is if you talked about your cat as Mrs. Slocum did on Are You Being Served?
Oh, what was some of her phrases? But are there accommodations for my pussy?
Yeah, like that. That would be the only thing that made it more British for me, I think. Okay, so before we actually talk about today's episode, and I've been telling people I'm doing this, so I know people are listening and excited. I think it behooves us to talk a little bit about death of an author because I think in the case of Buffy it applies more than it does to Harry Potter because J.K. Rowling is still involved a lot.
Mm,
For me, if you had asked me 2 years ago to do this episode, and the reason we're doing this in March is not just because it's musical month. March is also the Buffy anniversary. I
okay.
don't know when this was decided, but March is the month people celebrate Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Uh,
Okay.
as far as I'm aware, Joss Whedon has not been a big part of fandom in a long while. I know that the comic books have gone all the way out to season 12. I haven't read a comic book since they made Giles into like a younger version of himself, and since they brought in Billy. But I know the comics are still kind of going. I don't know how
Mm,
much he's involved in that. Um, this episode will be kind of Joss Whedon heavy, if only because Once More Feeling was something he really pushed for and something he'd been planning almost since the inception of the series.
mm,
And so a lot of what we're going to talk about is kind of overshadowed by the monster we found out Joss was. But beyond that, it feels like a lot of the principal actors still celebrate their roles. There's a big sense of community still for they're not called Slayerites anymore. They kind of go by the Scooby Gang still.
oh,
For Buffy
mm,
the Vampire Slayer fans, it does feel like there's still a sense of ownership that the Harry Potter fandom doesn't have just because J.K. Rowling just won't leave it alone. Um,
mm,
so if this is something where Joss's issues that he created behind the scenes, the things you've heard from the actresses that were in the show that kind of disturb you, doesn't sit well with your mental well-being, um, it's okay to not listen in. I would prefer if you did because I think this is a really important episode, both for Buffy and for television as a whole, and for
mm,
people of my generation. But I also want to honor people that can't overlook Joss, the monster. It's understandable. I understand it. I give you permission to go do something else if you need to. But for those who want to talk about it, we are going to talk about Once More with Feeling today, which
mm,
is probably the highest rated episode of Buffy that
mm,
was ever made. It has a 9.7 out of 10 on IMDb. Along with Hush, it is one of the episodes that won awards, and they both kind of have interesting theming parallels in them. And because it's an even numbered Buffy season, I really like it because for some reason the odd numbered Buffy seasons didn't do anything for me except for the final one. Um, but it's an even numbered Buffy season, so I'm a big fan of it. So
mm. You could say it might be something to do with ritual numbers and such, so maybe
yeah,
there's
it
something
could.
in there.
I
Yeah.
also think season 6 was really strong because it had a lot to prove and it had nothing to prove as well. Because season 6, in
Mm,
which Once More the Feeling takes place, was after the move to UPN, after WB had dumped what had been one of its flagship shows for 5 years. And so it both had nothing to prove, so it was more artistically free, and it had a lot to
mm,
prove to keep the fandom going and the spirit of Buffy alive. And I'd argue
yeah.
season 6 is probably the strongest season of the whole series, and that's as someone that is a big fan of Angel Angelus. So season 2 is very important. Season
Mm,
4, I actually really like the transition to college, but season 6 is where all of the things they talk about in Buffy generally really come to a head, and especially Once More
mm,
Feeling takes a lot of the ideas of family and communication and miscommunication and mistrust and it really creates this musical episode that isn't just a musical episode. And I think it's actually fairly important
Mm.
both for Buffy and for TV. So that's why I bamboozled Magnus into talking about it as as part of musical theater month, because it is music. It comes from that tradition. It just happened to be on TV. So
Mm. Well, you clearly have an immense passion for this episode. Well, for Buffy in general as
I mean,
well.
I enjoyed it more than Passions, although Spike loved Passions. That was a kind of a running theme throughout the show, which brings me amusement. So here's something interesting I found out before we talk about it: is
Mm,
that there are two versions of Buffy the Vampire Slayer actually in Britain, where you are. When it first came into syndication and it was on BBC One and I guess Skybox, they heavily edited it for the time slot it was in. Um, I could be wrong. I could get the names wrong, but the point is when it first came across the pond, they edited it the first couple of seasons, and there was such backlash they had to re-release it unedited in a later time slot so people could actually watch the episodes as intended. And even though there's not a great deal of violence in Buffy, it's much more cartoon kung fu violence than anything. There's like I find it interesting to think that you would need to really edit Buffy down that much. Um,
mm.
Anywho, that was something interesting I found out. I could be wrong about the names of the stations, but that's definitely something that is in the legacy of Buffy is the edited episodes. So
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to say I didn't think BBC One of all things would be showing Buffy because so for people that might not be aware of how our terrestrial television works over here, um we have five channels which are sort of like everyone can view. Well, if you have a TV license, BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, Channel 4, and Channel 5. And they're all quite well known for different styles of programming. And BBC One's always seen itself as more sort of like staunch, like family friendly, um, more, dare I say, slightly more serious television. So you'll get the news, you'll get documentaries and things. I'd have to check, but I think that Buffy would have been on BBC Two because that's where you got all of your sort of syndicated action shows and things like that. Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, all that stuff was on BBC Two. I remember lovely glorious days when I was a wee nipper watching all the like random episodes of basically everything because it was very difficult to get enough time to sit down and watch seasons week on week when there was so much going on as a teenager. Um,
yeah,
I, so yeah, it would have been that, but it was definitely a bit of a cult classic here in the UK when it was being shown.
yeah. And it
Um,
is
on the
that's one of Buffy's hallmarks. It's not
Mm,
only is Buffy a cult classic unto itself, but a lot of its references
mm,
are very cult, not just because it's the horror community. Buffy herself is based off of an X-Men character, very
yeah.
influenced by that. The series itself has the feeling of an updated version of the cult classic Night of the Comet, where it's an end of the world zombie apocalypse scenario, but the survivors that you stick with are like 80s Valley girls. And so, in a way, it's a show that is about pastiche, but it's also a show that's about the high school experience. So for me,
Mhm.
in Buffy, I went right from Boy Meets World when that premiered in '93, and then when Buffy premiered in, I think it was '97, if I remember correctly.
I think that's correct.
Yeah, so when Buffy premiered, I was just kind of aging out of Boy Meets World, but I still wanted to do like a high school series. I wasn't quite old enough for Freaks and Geeks. I wasn't quite old enough for what would become the kind of Boston Public show. And so I really kind of latched on to Buffy the Vampire Slayer for a reason a lot of
Mm,
people did. The pop culture references,
yeah.
the wink and nod to what maturity is, kind of the weirdness of it, the Nerf Herder intro theme, which is fairly iconic and which was so important to the show. It got one of the releases of the four different albums that were made for um for Buffy the
mm,
Vampire Slayer as a show. So it's a really big phenomenon. I think in
mm,
hindsight we don't feel it, but this show for 7 years
mm,
was I mean even its ending episode had almost 5 million viewers. I mean that is
mm.
not a small amount, especially
No.
for because WB and UPN here in the states were never really considered one of the big four
Mm,
stations, and so for them to have any kind of audience that size is really big. And we've got a role playing tabletop RPG game for Buffy now. um they've got board games that are still coming out. I think season 12 is still being written for the comic books, like it's still coming out. So Buffy is an ongoing thing, but it's just not as big as it used to be. And I don't know if people quite remember, but it was for a long time, if you were a Buffy
mm.
fan, that was kind of the center of your world because there was so much about it that you could enjoy depending upon what you liked in the show. So
Yes, and dare I say, it was part of that. Buffy was part of the sort of witchy magic revival era that you had at that time. You had Sabrina the Teenage Witch come out in 1996. Charm came out in 1998.
yeah.
Buffy came out in 1997. You had all of these different shows which had a heavy emphasis on mythology, magic, and women empowerment as well.
And
Um,
Xena Warrior Princess
yep.
is a little earlier, but I would also throw Xena in there when people compare musical episodes of things. There is a Xena musical episode. It's not as heavily musical, but um, there is yeah, like Xena would be a part of that. And then, of course, Buffy would
Mm,
lead to things like Heroes, which then leads to something like Once Upon a
yep.
Time and Sense8. So yeah, so Buffy is kind of in the middle of all of this, which is
Mm,
really cool. So
yes. Um, no, definitely. And I'd like to touch upon the musical episode's impact a little later on in terms of what it influenced down the
yeah,
line. But maybe we should look at the actual substance of the episode first before I raise that point.
sure.
Mm,
So something important about this musical episode is that
mm,
one of the things I was reading in the wiki, which I hadn't considered, is the idea that this episode allows people to communicate in a way that musical
mm,
theater doesn't often allow. And so, a big hallmark of Buffy season 6 isn't just the transition into further adulthood, but specifically, this episode is about things that they've been unwilling to communicate for a while. So, this is
mm,
kind of a nexus point of the series going back before it was on UPN and moving forward through the rest of season 6. So,
mm.
yeah,
Yeah, it definitely was a culmination of 5 seasons of various things that had been coming up and such. And I mean, you'd had dramatic events happen before this. I believe this was after Buffy's resurrection.
yes, that's a big crux of the episode, actually.
Mm, yes. So definitely, I was just thinking, you were saying about musical theatre doesn't allow people to speak in this way, but quite often you see people on stage belting out, "I miss her, I want her."
Yeah,
Isn't that the crux of musical theatre, though?
but this is a case in which it's used for people to actually hear others' thoughts. There isn't really an aside
Mm.
aspect to it. One thing that's great about this is the intentionality of everyone hearing everyone else sing.
Ah,
Is really important. It's not just playful, but it also changes the dynamic of the show moving forward because everything that happens after this episode, Buffy's revelation about having been in heaven instead of hell, the revelation that Willow was messing with Tara's memory so Tara wouldn't leave her, um, the revelation of uh, Giles not really wanting to be a father figure to Dawn, like all the different revelations that happen in this episode impact all the individual storylines. And it's really good. I will also point out that this episode is the only episode to feature, except for Amber Benson as Tara, this episode features all of the main cast that had been there for the longest amount of time. And the only reason that Tara McClay doesn't have more screen time is because she's not really in season 7 that much. But like this episode features literally all of the main cast members that had been in pretty much all of the episodes up to that point. Michelle Trachtenberg is obviously the kind of outlier as Dawn, but she'd been a big part of the series since the start of season 5. So
Hmm. So, would you argue that narratively, from what you said, considering it was a nexus for stuff beforehand and what happens next, would you say narratively this is perhaps the most important um, episode of the season, if not maybe of the series?
I think that would be a very fair assessment because in Buffy they always had a monster of the week that kind of led into the big bad of the season, quote unquote. So you've got,
Mm.
Faith in the Mayor in season 3, Glory in season 5, even Angel Angelus in season 2. So I would say there are some episodes in season 2, like in Innocence, where Buffy brings Angelus back through sleeping with him, that is a very important turning point in the series because it affects everything that happens down the road. But I think even in context of season 7 and the final battle and things like that, I think more attention to detail was placed in this. But I also think that because the point of Buffy was never really about slaying vampires, it was about the idea of what vampires represented. Um, that it is probably one of the more important episodes in the whole series. Perfectly honest.
Because it sounds as if like it sounds like if they hadn't had this episode, then what came afterwards might have been incredibly different.
I don't know how else they would have done a reveal
Mm.
episode that wouldn't have just been exposition. Something about musicals that makes them great is that you can use a song to do the
Mm.
exposition, to act as an aside, to give an emotional intensity to something without interrupting the story to do so. Here, there are winks and nods to the idea of breaking the fourth wall. Uh, there are great songs about people being really honest in a way they can't be otherwise. The music accompanies that,
Mm.
especially when Buffy talks about "I think I was in heaven." It goes down to like a B diminished, very sour note, and her voice gets really strained. And I
Mm.
think that there's something in doing that where if she had just been honest with them about where she had been without the musical accompaniment, it wouldn't have worked as well. I
Mm.
also love seeing Sunnydale more highly stylized in color, which was not something you saw a lot of in the show, because a lot of it was very shadowy, very nighttime. This is a version of Sunnydale that's very saturated in color. The costumes were a little more saturated in color, especially in the bronze, which was made bigger for this specific episode. The villain of the episode is very queer coded, which is super cool. Hinton Battle, I think I got that name right, who plays Sweet. The demon was from Broadway. And so there's a lot of great stuff with this kind of one-off villain you never see again, and it's always a villain who. And I think I'm getting better at makeup enough that I could do this. This would be like one of the two roles from Buffy I would ever cosplay as. Would be Sweet the Demon.
Oh,
Yeah,
that
the other one
high
I can't.
praise indeed.
The other one I can't figure out how to do because it would involve me floating in the air, and I can't quite figure out the budget for for floating platform shoes.
Well, if I ever have some surplus amount of money, sir, then let's talk about it. We'll find you some sort of like transparent stage or something that you can stand on, and then
Yeah,
that would give you the illusion of floating. If we ever have a chance to do that.
I appreciate that. I think what maybe we should do for this episode is we can just
Hmm.
kind of go through the episode, and
Okay.
inside of going through that, we'll be able to discuss both the series and this episode itself.
Okay.
One thing to know is that this episode was not heavily edited, but it's the longest episode of Buffy. It is 8 minutes over every other episode, and that was after editing, apparently. Um, and the edits are very minor. I think there's one verse of a song that was taken out, but there was much longer overture intro before going through the motions that we don't get, which might actually be on the cast album for this. Um, the cast album is amazing visually. If you've never seen the Once More with Feeling cover album with the blue and the really kind of old Roger and Hammerstein font, you should find it. It's really good looking. Um,
Mhm.
but we start off with a torch song from Buffy. So they talk about this as like part of your world. This is a musical tradition where there's an I want song where a character sings about what they want or what they're missing, and that's how you kind of align yourself and you kind of choose to cheer for them with the show. They start off with that. They start off with the going through the motions song, which Sarah Michelle Gellar is walking through a graveyard, stabbing vampires into dust, talking about how everything doesn't feel real anymore, and she's going through the motions of life. And it's a really strong opening song in my mind. Also, because the vampires get into it with her, she's not just singing. Like the vampires are responding in song too as she's stabbing them. That's really only something Buffy could get away with. Like, I think Charmed even took itself a little seriously in that if Charmed had tried to do this, it would not have gone off, in my mind. I could be wrong about that. But
Mm.
I feel like Charmed was really great for a lot of things. I don't think Charmed could have really done a musical episode, at least not the way Buffy did. So
No, I see your point because trying to think how to describe it. I instinctively know what you're talking about. Um, I think the best way to describe it is that Charmed always had it a bit more serious and a bit more um definitely not playing around with the pop culture elements and such. Um, whereas Buffy, because of its distinct like campiness in places,
yeah,
um, can kind of embrace it a bit more freely than what Charm could have done. It probably would have come across as a bit too forced if they tried to write some demon cursing the sisters to start singing their of feelings everywhere. Sorry, I'm just
yeah.
imagining it.
No, it's okay, and this is where someone who loves
Mm,
genre shows, which is what Buffy and Charm both really were,
mm,
there
yeah.
is a difference between these types of shows. You can even look at
Oh yeah.
something like Buffy versus Angel, the spin-off of it.
Mm,
There's something very different in tone. There's something very different in style, and so like genre shows aren't a one for one. Like the Beauty and the Beast procedural from the 80s can't be like the Beauty and the Beast procedural from like the 2010s or whenever they made that show.
mm,
Because it's a genre, it's stylized, but it's also Buffy was very adamant about not taking itself too seriously. That Night of the Comet push to kind of give commentary, to start creating lingo in pop culture was just not something Charmed did. It was a very good show, but that was not the point of Charmed.
no.
Um, I think so, at least. All right. So then here's something kind of interesting. So next morning at the Magic Box, which is where most of the characters now work outside of Buffy, who I think might still work at the chicken place where she almost got like murdered by the old grandma. That
Not
was
chicken
like
fillet.
not Chick-fil-A. It was an in it yeah, Chick-fil-A was never that popular. It's a weird thing, but it was like an in series like fast food place that she worked at in uh mid season 5 after Joyce had died.
Okay.
Which is also a really great episode. Hush the Body and Once More with Feeling are three of the strongest episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I think.
Mm,
So Buffy comes to the Magic Box and lies about not being able to remember what she sang about because she cannot tell these people that resurrected her that they took her out of heaven. because they were. By the way, this is like the one time in all the Buffyverse that we really see heaven mentioned. By the way,
Hmm.
in this episode, because most of the time Joss kind of couched it in like an etherealness. He used the phrase "powers that be" or PTB, which became a big thing in the fandom. This is really the first and maybe the only time I think in all Buffyverse where it's actually called heaven as a concept. I don't think that occurs anywhere else that I can remember in the entire show. Because Hell be a lava, because they're on the Hellmouth, the hell is, symbolism for all the things you go through at maturity. This is the first time, and maybe the only time heaven is alluded to. I don't think even in the comic series, heaven is alluded to that much. So I find
I
that very interesting. So
I don't remember if I've heard it elsewhere myself on the top of my head, but I haven't read a number of the books and the comics, I can't I can't say whether they do mention it or not in there.
there's a lot of comics and they're not evenly paced. That's all that I will say about the comics right now. I would argue that when the gang here sings all together, when they do the I've Got a Theory song with Anya Bunnies, and then um, the If We're Together thing that Buffy instigates, um, this is probably the most remembered song from this show currently because it's one of the funnier songs, and it's probably one of the only times we hear Willow sing in the whole show because Allison Hannigan begged Joss to not make her sing too much. Famously, one of the things that people loved about this is that all the actors sang, even if they
Hmm.
didn't have strong acting talents. The only two that have acting talents, like credentials, are James Marster, who was in a band, and Anthony Stewart Head, who played Giles, who, if you've seen Repo the Genetic Opera, he sings in that. But he'd also been in Godspell Chess and the Rocky Horror Show. Um, so Anthony Stewart
Oh
Head,
yeah.
like, so when he sang on the show, that was actually him singing in this episode. You see a little bit of what we got in Repo out of him. But quite famously, Michelle Trachtenberg was like, "Please don't make me sing too much. I have ballet training. Just make me dance." And then Allison Hannigan was like, "Please don't make me sing at all." But we go from this kind of "if we're in it together, we can succeed" song that Buffy starts, and then we get Tara and Willow doing their sapphic ode, Under Your Spell, which later we get a kind of bitter reprise of really well. But Under Your Spell is the dirtiest song. And Joss Whedon kind of claimed this. It was the dirtiest song he'd ever write, but it's also the most poignant. And I think it's important to know that Under Your Spell is an important moment in Sapphic television because Tara and Willow were the first lesbian couple um, reoccurring
Hmm.
on TV, and so this very intimate, very like Lilith Fair body worship of the female body song is not just erotic, but it's also just important in how representation occurred on television.
Hmm.
Is it perfect? No, it is not perfect. Especially now, some of the transition scenes in the song do show age, but it's kind of like Clarissa Explains It All, in which even though it's kind of showing its age, it's still very important. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, but
Yes.
Under Your Spell is a great song, not just because Under Your Spell is a great song about a relationship, but because that reprise done later, where Tara does it with Giles, um, is this great flip between desire and truth that is kind of an underlying concept um, in this whole production. So yeah.
Hmm. Um. Oh, I forgot what my point was going to be. What was my point going to be? Oh yes, I was going to say that. Well, the thing is, groundbreaking stuff is rarely perfect.
Yeah.
Um, because of the fact that it's something new and such. Um, if it hasn't been something done before that is being done for the first time, um, you can't expect it to, have all the kinks worked out and such. I mean, I was discussing this with someone a while back about the old Queer as Folk. Like, it does feel dated now when you rewatch it, but at the same time, it was so groundbreaking for the time it came out, and it is still a landmark piece of queer representation on television.
Yeah.
Um, and you just have to accept it that it's a, dare I say, a product of its era. And that sort of also makes it quite
And,
important in that sense.
and I would throw something like Boys in the Band in along with
Mm.
that, where now it feels very piercing and a little hurtful. But at that time, Boys in the Band was the only discussion about queer culture that was being had on stage anywhere. So you have to give things a little grace, um, especially
Mm.
something like that. I don't think people understand that even when this episode came out in 2001, except for special coming out or lesbian kiss episodes, there were not lesbians on TV. There were no lesbians in Will and Grace. The only lesbian on mainstream was um, Ross's first wife and her lover on Friends, and they were constantly the butt of jokes when they did not
Yeah,
deserve that. Ross does not come out great in that series, and I'm really glad
no.
people are finally getting it. But like, I don't think
Mm.
people understand. Like, I feel like Under Your Spell is a really important thing to have done that is on par with what Queer as Folk did in being very brazen about the idea of sex and sexuality. And I think Under Your Spell is a very good song. I just think like the visuals distract a little bit of it, but it's a playful song. It's a sexual song. Um, it's a song that easily would not be like out of place on a Melissa Etheridge CD, and I would not be mad about it. I would like to see. So when people talk about this episode, they talk about little one-off songs like "The Mustard," where David Fury, who's one of the executive producers, does like an 18-second song, and these like little 18-second songs are fillers in between the bigger emotional songs. I kind of wish people would point to Under Your Spell more than they would point to something like The Mustard. Not that The Mustard's not a great song, but the emotional songs are more important to me here. Just like the
Mm.
emotional songs, the emotional beats of Buffy have always been the important thing. And I would argue Under Your Spell is followed by I'll Never Tell, which is kind of this bubblegum pop 1950s old school pastiche how to succeed in business number, and it's not bad, but Under Your Spell very much means a lot more than I'll Never Tell, even though I'll Never Tell is more important to the plot of the story. Under Your Spell, I think, is a much bigger song. um
Mm.
yeah.
Mm. No, no, it's I was just thinking back to Willow now that you speak of her and such. From what I recall, everyone over here was always quite like, I didn't hear any bad negative commentary about Willow. She was always quite well received, um, as a LGBT icon
I think
over
Willow's
this
an
side.
important character. I do wish, and this could have been done because there have been lots of philosophy books written about Buffy. I kind of wish, and we didn't have this language in 2001 on TV, but
Mm.
people call her a lesbian icon, but she was dating Oz for a while, and it never felt
Mm.
inauthentic. So I do wonder if it would be more appropriate to have Willow as a bisexual icon that just happened to be
Mm.
in a sapphic relationship when Tara passed away. It's one of those
It's
things where,
true.
like, I do wonder if we shouldn't be reclaiming Willow as a bisexual icon. I don't know if Allison Hannigan has been asked about that, but she's been very honest about her time on Buffy. So, um,
Mm.
yeah.
Might might have to put a pin in that and go away and do further research.
Well, and Buffy is one of those shows where we'll probably do more about the series as a whole.
Mm.
Because I would argue we could at least do like a 4 episode structure, like what we did for Once Upon a Time with Buffy.
Oy.
Um, there'd be plenty there. But it's one of those things where like it was important to me to kind of talk about this during musical theater month because there's so many different traditions
Mm.
of musical theater in this show. The next song up after I'll Never Tell is Spike, who's played by James Marsters, fabulously doing Rest in Peace, a song where he kind of rebuffs Buffy, even though they have this like secret friendship and she has confessed to him that she was in heaven. So he's the only one that knows the secret that he's also bearing. And he went through this big life transition and going from being kind of this carefree monster to have a chip implanted in him so he could only hurt other monsters. And it was acting as sort of the pseudo soul. Rest in Peace is the one that my friend who I introduced Buffy to, who's like one of my quote unquote straight friends, this was his favorite song in the show. It's very brooding, very rock and roll. James Marsters' Billy Idol persona is on full display as Spike, and I think this song works particularly well as its own kind of I want slash torch song. And it also means that if you look at Going Through the Motions and Rest in Peace together, it shows how well suited Buffy and Spike really were for each other in the second half of Buffy's life, quote unquote. So
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, Spike. Sorry, I'm remembering all of the all the slash fiction with him and Angel at the second, because that was something that was a minor period that happened as well.
I was a much bigger fan of Angel and Xander, but that was just stuff that I had to work through for myself. Angel was one of my first queer awakenings on TV, and I'm pretty honest about that as part of my journey as a writer. Um, but yeah, so Rest in Peace is a really great example of kind of, I guess, a male torch song because you don't really get men doing I Want songs on Broadway as much. Um,
Hmm.
Grow for Me from Little Shop, I can think of. Um, Maybe a couple of songs from Cats, but they're not really. Cats is not a show you take very seriously, honestly. Um, Even in something really high and melodramatic and artistic like Phantom of the Opera, I guess Les Mis probably has one. But off the top of my head, I can't think of a lot of songs like
Hmm.
Rest in Peace, which is really a song about the confliction of desire. It takes place almost solely underground, which is really neat, not just because he's a vampire, but it has that very grungy, earthen, um, almost the complement of the idea of both of them being Walking Dead, essentially, because he's a vampire and she just feels empty after being pulled out of heaven. So
Hmm.
I think Rest in Peace is probably a really exquisite song that when people rediscover it, they love it. But like you have to like get to the place in the show where you rediscover the song.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting to give um Spike such such a powerful song, particularly in a female-centric show where
Yeah.
I know that Spike, Xander, Giles, Angel, they were never said second fiddle to any of the female cast members, but Buffy always was a like,
Yeah, well, Angel only got a spinoff because they did that episode with the bees where he had like his female centered monologue when they switched genders in their soul. That was the only reason that he got Angel the spinoff was because they saw him be able to act in his more feminine nature still as Angel. So
Mm,
it's not out of place to say. Joss Whedon has said in an interview somewhere, it ended up on Wikipedia, that um, Stephen Sondheim really influenced the way that things happened in Once More Feeling. So I bet if you look at Company or Sweeney Todd, there's probably a song that comes close to Rest in Peace. Like maybe Rest in Peace is the inversion of Johanna, which is very light and playful and loving. Because Rest in Peace isn't quite like Being Alive. It has some shades of that. It could be a little bit like Marry Me a Little. So I was thinking about this. I was like, there's probably some good um angry bro songs. Maybe there's something in We Will Rock You from Queen Canon that would fit this. But Rest in Peace does feel very much on its own when I think of standard male songs done in Broadway. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, I'm just hmm. just having to think about various um male-esque songs. We've mentioned about Phantom
Yeah.
with the Phantom, but a lot of the time, um, the male voc the male characters within Broadway shows usually do duets and such, and
Yeah.
their
I mean,
solos don't always get the
there
attention they
might
really
be
deserves.
there might be something
Mm.
in like Hades Town that is like that,
Mm.
but I prefer Eurydice by Sarah Rule. So I haven't seen Hades Town. There might be something also in Urinetown, but except for like Rent, thinking about male stylings in rock operas, there's not a lot of them where they seem singularly like rest in peace. But I'm to think about that, and I'm sure people will in the comments will be like, "This song is like that, and this song is like that."
Mhm.
Um, Potentially, Anthony Stewart Head's songs in Repo the Genetic Opera do kind of have a rest in peace feel, but I don't know how much of that was Darren Zadidnik doing rock and how much of that was intentional. So.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
after after Rest in Peace, we go to the next morning, and this is where this episode starts to influence everything that's going to happen after it. Because the next 20 minutes of this show, essentially, in the middle of it, is everything that is going to tear apart the things that we've known about the Buffy universe and are eventually going to change everything's our characters experience. It's going to lead directly to Willow's dark magic arc. It's going to lead directly to Giles going back um, to England to be with the Watchers Council, which is going to influence season 7. It's going to lead directly to Buffy having um, to take responsibility not just for Dawn but for her life and the things she's responsible for, because part of the series is the push and pull between Buffy's calling as the Slayer and Buffy wanting to either be, a normal girl or to not have to deal with the everyday monster thing and the Hellmouth. And so a lot of things that happen the next 20 minutes of the show, from the next morning where Dawn and Tara have a conversation about Tara and Willow making up, to the moment Dawn is put into a situation where she has to do her ballet thing, to Giles singing about not wanting to take care of Dawn and having that be something that is kind of his red line, to the Under Your Spell reprise. The next 20 minutes are all of things that, except for Anya and Xander, resonate through the rest of the show and change the
Mm.
direction that the show goes. It's a very powerful 20 minutes, and when it premiered, I don't know if anybody really, because it just seems like Dawn is becoming a kleptomaniac. She's stealing stuff, and one of the things happens to be Sweet's little insignia thing. So there's kind of a throwaway thing that maybe Dawn did actually accidentally summon him. And then she gets kidnapped, so she's going through a damsel in distress period. Um, and then Giles and Buffy have that non-conversation where Buffy is basically ordering Giles to talk to Dawn about her like kleptomania, and Giles and Tara both having realized what their kind of respective life partners are asking of them is not something they can bear. Tara's like, I am an ethical witch. And Willow's crossing lines, including erasing my memory. And Giles is like, yeah, I'm kind of your father figure, but I'm not responsible for Dawn. Um, it's this really interesting moment of this kind of anti I want song, more of I wish things had been a different way, kind of like the yearning closing of a chapter song. And I think Standing and the Under Your Spell reprise together is incredibly heartbreaking and incredibly poignant, and probably the best portion of this show
Mm.
in my mind. I really do think that this moment is emotional crux that changes the scope of the Buffy universe. And I think this is a moment where Joss probably gave absolutely no F's about what he
Mm.
was doing, because Buffy at this point was kind of a sacred cow. There were just things that you really didn't mess with, and kind of the makeup of the Scooby Gang, which had so solidly been, even after Riley had left the show, after Mark Lucas had left the show, had solidly been about this group of characters for so long. It was a bit of a sacred cow, and to
Mm.
break it apart like happened in this episode and in future episodes is it's kind of a masterwork. I wish Joss hadn't been the monster we found out he was, because this episode is a masterwork of what to do well in emotional beat and storytelling. And it makes
Mm.
me so upset that it's so overshadowed by his legacy. Um,
Mm.
and I think the show deserves better than that, frankly speaking. So, but
Yes.
yeah, so the Under Your Spell um, and Standing is probably one of the better moments of emotional television for people not just of my age, maybe of all television. Um, it doesn't get nearly enough credit, and it gets
Mm.
overshadowed by the upcoming Walk Through the Fire, where Buffy is going to go face down Sweet. Because Walk Through the Fire is a great song. It has Joss Whedon's favorite shot of the entire series in it, um, but it's not as emotionally impactful as Under Your Spell Standing, except for the fact that Walk Through Fire is really about Buffy coming to terms with the emptiness inside of herself. So it's important, but for me, I think Under Your Spell Standing is probably slightly more important for the rest of the characters and Buffy. It's a fine line. It's hard to
Mm.
it's a very emotional it's a very emotional portion of time in the show. So
So what I was going to ask you, uh, um, and I understand that this question, you may not have a answer straight away because it probably requires some thought to it. Clearly, this episode and these particular moments we've just talked about are quite impactful, to say the least. Would you say that any other series has done anything equivalent to this in terms of like sheer impact on the story and the narrative?
Um, I think in terms of groundbreaking television, I would put Mary Tyler Moore on that list because everything Mary Tyler Moore was doing was groundbreaking. There had never been a show about a woman in the workplace like Mary before, a divorced woman. Um,
I was more meaning like that this episode, which is clearly one that rocks the entire story and sends it into a whole other um, direction. Um, and as you say, like there were certain sacred lines that the fandom had for
yeah,
the show, sort of like, and that's sort of sorry, that's sort of the direction I was
okay.
asking. With like, has any writer done an equivalent daring move like this?
The finale of Oz comes to mind
Mm.
when Beecher stabs Keller in their Julius Caesar show. um,
Mm.
because that toxic love story had been going on for seasons at that point and had been become the crux of why many people
Mm.
watched the show, me included. Obviously, I can't speak for everyone. I would still put Mary Tyler Moore in there
Okay.
because the way that Mary carried herself throughout the series, both with humor, but also with having the dialogue about what it meant to be kind of striking out on your own, was very important. Um, this is why I wish Joss had been a better person, because there's not. There are shows that try to do that. Like when you think about the run that Glee had, several times it tried so hard to make something like Buffy happen. In fact, Marty Noxon, um, I'm not sure if this is actually true. I learned this and now I wonder if it was true, but Marty Noxon was part of the writing team for Glee. She was the reason Darren Criss was written the way he was in his early um, portion of time as Blaine, or at least that's what I've been told. I'm wondering now if that's accurate, but there are a lot of shows that have tried to do this. Ally McBeal, which is kind of a fourth wall breaking predecessor to Buffy, had some things like this. I would argue Freaks and Geeks tried to do it. I would say One Tree Hill always tried to be melodramatic in a Buffy way, in an emotional way, instead of like necessarily a physical plot way. but One Tree Hill didn't do as well. Um, because that was too grounded in reality. I think there are moments, but I think for a show that was based around the idea of a cult classic, I think for a show that had specific genre conventions, it was twisting around and turning. I think Buffy kind of does stand alone in this regard. I would maybe say Star Trek: The Next Generation introducing Q, maybe because it added a
Mm.
religious element that Star Trek didn't necessarily have before. But then that's just me kind of like desperately pulling threads, trying to figure out if I can think
It,
of something. But a lot of
the,
HBO shows
mm,
like The Wire, maybe Breaking Bad would have had something like this at a certain point. Um, Queer as Folk kind of did in its own way, but it was also very much a show about relationship, but in a mundane way. So maybe
mm,
Queer as Folk in looking at that. I didn't watch the British version, but I watched the American version, which was very true to the spirit of the British version for the first three seasons.
mm,
But yeah, I think this was. I think it's because Joss, at the height of his power, knew he could do something like this, and then of course we
mm,
get Doctor Horrible sing along blog um, after this during the writer's strike, and we get his version of that Shakespeare play that he did in black and white that he filmed like at a house over the weekend. I can't remember which Shakespeare show it is. So Joss didn't have fear about doing this, both because season six was in a new studio, so like he had to kind of restart the series almost, and maybe he also thought it was going to fail, so he was going to go out with the bang, and whether it was well liked or not, he was like, I'm just going to do this now, because most of the cast was like, you are going to ruin our careers with this. um because he and his wife at the time recorded all the songs, and obviously you miss a lot when you're hearing someone else singing a demo tape. The demo recordings, by the way, can be found on the Once More with Feeling CD. They might be on the vinyl as well, but they do have the demo reels from Joss and his wife singing all the songs as like extra songs. Um,
mm,
so yeah, it's one of those things where like there are really important moments in television, and I do think Once More with Feeling hits that in a lot of ways. Breaking of convention is so important to Buffy, the way it approaches pop culture, the way it approaches relationship. Um, and the unexpected reveal of Xander as the one that summoned Sweet because he was so worried about his marriage, his upcoming wedding, and now wanting to be his dad, and that kind of haunted, abusive, alcoholic father that has shadowed Xander the whole time in the series is the whole reason we have this episode, which is a great reveal because it's not about Dawn at all. It's really about Xander's fear. And then
mm,
when he leaves Anya at the altar later, that fear is realized because like a male revenge demon, which is what she was doing as a female revenge demon, basically gets revenge on her by getting Xander to leave her at the altar. It's a great like this episode sets up so much of what we're going to see in season six and season seven, including Xander and Anya missing each other in the finale, which is something Joss was also very proud of.
mm,
Yeah, but what's great
mhm,
is that it's such a subtle thing where you think it's all about Dawn being kidnapped, and you think it's about the little trinket, and oh, Dawn just made a little mistake, but it's really about Tara and Willow and Tara being manipulated. It's about Giles wanting Buffy to take responsibility for her life. And then it's about Buffy walking toward doom. She basically Walk Through Fire is a song about where she's going to fight Sweet and she's pretty sure she's not coming out of the Bronx. Like if you really listen to Walk Through the Fire and you get past the really cute thing with the fire trucks coming at the end, all of Buffy's support system has left her at this point. Walk Through the Fire is about somebody's support system pushing them out and saying, no, you have to do this. And though the support system says, no, no, in about 5 minutes, they go after her because they realize she can't do it on her own. And Spike comes in from a different location as well. So he's a different form of the support system. Um, Walk Through the Fire is about it's Walk Through the Fire is like a D&D character song for someone going to a dragon den that is pretty sure the dragon is going to eat them. And what's really great about the songs that she sing with Sweet is not about her having a song to sing, it's about having something worth it to sing about. There's a portion of time where I was worried in first watching the episode that this was actually the end of Buffy legitimately, because there's a portion in the end of this episode where all the people that Sweet has killed as a demon are spontaneously combusting from like all of the musical energy inside them, like manifesting physically. And so all the people that have died throughout the course of this episode literally don't just spontaneously combust into song, they literally spontaneously combust. Which is a really weird and interesting way for a demon to kill people, by the way, because like the first person that dies, you don't even know what's happening, and there's just like this tap dance sequence where he bursts into flames. It's high art. It's wonderful. It's the best TV art you'll ever see. Um, but Buffy is basically, even though she can heal herself quickly because she's a Slayer, she has all this physical prowess. She's at a point where she's willing to give it up, and not just does Spike save her, but Sweet isn't really a demon that's evil. He is evil, but he's also just reflecting back to all the characters the things that they have not been able to say. And he's very glib and honest about that. And I think Hinton Battle's time, especially in The Wiz, was really instrumental because he did some choreography. But really, when I think about Sweet, I think about him singing. I think about his quick change from the blue suit to the red suit, which I'm very jealous of. And if I can figure out a way to do that at con, that would be amazing. Um, there's something really great about Dawn being a catalyst for the last portion of this episode, but it's not about her. Much like season 5 is about Dawn, but it's not really about Dawn. And then season 7, when Michelle Trachtenberg as Dawn kind of comes into her own, you're still getting part of that for Dawn, but Dawn in this episode is starting to really realize something that she can't verbalize yet about why she also feels kind of this emptiness and why she's stealing stuff and why she's doing things. Um, that's always the Buffy spinoff I never got, and I always wish we had been able to see, because in season 7 they give Dawn her own version of Willow and Xander, and then we never see him again after the episode they're in, and I'm always bummed by that because I always wondered, because Michelle Trachtenberg as Harriet the Spy, and doing other things, always kind of was able to stand on her own in an ensemble cast. And I'm kind of bummed that Dawn never really got that due in the series, except for the episode where they mistakenly think she's a potential Slayer in season 7. Um, but it's such an interesting, because they end the show using these opposite color palettes for costumes. They end the show with Spike and Buffy kissing, and literally curtains closing. Like, everyone's very aware what this episode is. They were not trying to hide that it was a musical episode. It didn't feel like the Scrubs musical episode where it was like the rug is pulled out from under you, like Scrubs tried to do to give it emotional impact. Um, I think Once More Feeling is not just an important stylistic episode, but it's one of the people that like greenlit the album for this saw it and thought it was the most important moment on television they'd ever seen. Um, I think that was one of the album producers actually who saw it and was like, "Why is there not a cast album of this yet?" And fun fact, until 2007, when the rights were pulled, this was actually on track to becoming like the next big midnight movie thing. Like, people were making callbacks. They were showing it at a theater in New York. And when the rights were pulled in 2007 and they had to stop doing it, everybody was sad about that. But this was something where, of a cult classic TV show, there was a cult around this particular episode, which is really easy to see. even if you're not a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and you haven't seen a full episode of it, this will give you all that you need to understand the dynamic of the group in season 6. Right off the bat, you get vampires being staked and singing in a graveyard. It really tells you all the things you need to know about the show to get you there in about 10 minutes. So
Hmm. I never really thought of this episode as potentially a late season introduction
yeah,
point, but it could, in a way, serve as that since pretty much it's explaining some stuff that's happened before and allowing people to pick off from the aftermath of
yeah,
this
and
episode.
I think this is one thing that it does better than Hush because Hush as an episode doesn't stand alone. And as much as I love Hush, and as much as I love, because the parallels in theming between Hush and Once More's feeling about communication or the lack thereof are very there. But in Hush, when the sound gets turned off and people begin to communicate, you still need more context from earlier in the season. Because if you don't have the context, you don't understand why Buffy can't talk to Riley. You don't understand who Giles's one-off friend with benefit from England that comes in that we never see again. You don't really understand what Willow is going through because at that point in season 4, I don't think she'd really come out yet as much as she was in season 6. I can't remember where she was in season 4 during Hush for the coming out, but I think that's the episode where she and Tara actually share power for the first time. Um, but this episode is self-contained not just because it's a musical, but it's self-contained because you don't necessarily need to know who Buffy is to get there. Like you get everything, you get the information visually, you get it physically. You understand that Buffy is a place where pop culture is celebrated, not shied away from. You understand that they understand they're on a TV show. It's a little more pronounced because Anya does a lot of fourth wall breaking a la Deadpool. But in terms of the series, Anya's always a character that kind of sees through the BS just because she's lived so long. Um, and you get a lot of the emotion of what the characters are going through. Giles' struggle with being Buffy's father figure isn't new, but it's maybe the first time since she died that he has verbalized it. Because when he leaves the Watcher Council, um, yeah, when he leaves the Watcher Council, it's kind of this just accepted thing that he is going to be her father figure. But at some point, she does need to stand on her own 2 feet, and it's a really great song because it is more of an aside. She doesn't hear him. She's doing a training montage in the background while he's singing, and Willow can't hear Tara, and it's the one time in the show where people can't hear each other that are in the same room, and that's why I think it's slightly more important and impactful than Walk Through Fire. Um, I guess they're impactful in their own way. I don't want to slam Walk Through Fire because I do think it's an excellent song. But if you're looking at this episode mechanically and what it does in terms of the show and for the characters, I do think Standing and the reprise of Under Your Spell, which takes that lovely sapphic overtone and turns it a little mistrustful and bitter, um, I think that's more important in a way. It's less funny, but it's more important because Walk Through Fire does have a tinge of hilarity to it that you really need in this episode because this episode would be really heavy if nobody was having fun. Like you need the parking ticket song, you need the mustard song because in concept on paper, this episode really is a very heavy. Like
Hmm.
this would be like the Little Foxes or Streetcar Named Desire. You know, it would be a very heavy, very talked, very brutal episode if
Yeah.
it was not a fun musical romp.
And musical episodes aren't usually heavy in terms of its subject matter. If you look at other various musical episodes that you've had, Once Upon a Time, you mentioned the Scrubs musical
Yeah.
episode. Oh, there's a few. I was just trying to remember a few other ones, but I don't recall any other musical episodes um having such heavy subject matter
Yeah, there
within
were a
them.
couple. Actually, on the Wikipedia page for Once More with Feeling, they talk about other musical episodes of shows. Let's see if I can actually find it. They reference the Tonight Quintet from West Side Story when talking about Walk Through Fire, by the way, which I think is relatively important. Uh, Also, the soundtrack peaked at number 3 on the U.S. Billboard Top Soundtrack, by the way, for this.
Ooh.
So that just tells you. Okay, here it is. So, since Buffy aired, several other series have done musical episodes, including Scrubs. The episode is called My Musical. Grey's Anatomy did one, and Batman
Nice.
Brave and the Bold. I don't think they've um, updated this portion because you should also now have in here there was an episode of I don't know if it was Flash or Supergirl, but they did an episode where Darren Criss played the Music Meister. I think it was the Music Meister, and so Grant
Ooh.
Gustin and
I think it was
Supergirl
Flash. But,
sang. I
mm,
can't remember. It was a crossover, but so that is missing. So but yeah, it's not. You have to really be on a show where you have a fan base willing to go with the musical episode. I think
yeah.
particularly the Scrubs one was so lighthearted until the ending, and it was also because JD was always Zach Braff was always like verging into musical territory in his mind, anyways. So
Yes. Well, that touches. I mean, I was going to say that touches nicely on what I want to talk about this episode's legacy and such afterwards. I just want to check first. How did you want to bring up any more points regarding the context of the episode?
I think the context of it most important for me is that in the context of really good Buffy episodes, because not every episode of Buffy was as good as people want to remember it being. But in the context of probably top 5, top 10 Buffy episodes, I can't think of a Buffy fan who doesn't have Once More's Feeling hovering around their top 3 somewhere. I think for me, I'm such an Angel fan, in a sense, might go above Once More with Feeling, but I think in context of Buffy the Vampire Slayer as a show, you cannot understate how important and how wonderful this is for the fandom. And when people bring it up, there are smiles on faces all around. All you have to do is like shout the word bunnies at a Buffy fan, and they'll giggle. And I think that that really does say something. And I love the iconography of Sweet. I do think because when we see demons on TV, even the demons in Charmed tended to be less suave and less dancerly, and Sweet was such a different sort of demon that you really didn't see again prosthetically, makeup wise, and in character until we met Lorne in the later seasons of Angel, um, who had that more kind of femme Oscar Wilde energy. And so
Hmm.
I think Sweet here should be highlighted almost as a remembrance back to the first from season 1, but also potentially toward Caleb, who would be Nathan Fillion's evil misogynistic preacher character in season 7. So yeah,
Hmm.
I could ramble about it. It really does lead into what the series is about, where it's going, and where it could go. So yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. So, in terms of this episode with Legacy, I think it really did revive the concept of having music within. So, with actually within a show, for performances and such. Um, I mean, you always had the openings and the closers and such, and if the show was about music to begin with, then that was the thing. But actually having musical episodes or having a show devoted towards musical theatrics was something that Once More Feeling really helped to push again. We've mentioned like the musical specials that different shows did. Um, from what I understand, this also had an impact on shows like Glee emerging and on High School Musical becoming a thing as well. And then from there, High School Musical influenced other musical shows that were coming and movies that were coming out on the Disney Channel, such as Camp Rock, Descendants, Zombies, etc. Um, so there's quite a sizable legacy that this episode's left, not just for the Buffyverse, but beyond that, in a whole other segment of television.
And it is part of a legacy of prestige television.
Mm,
I would say music was always rather instrumental in TV in America, at least. Because when you think about theme songs for songs, if you think about the Growing Pains theme song, if you think about the All in the Family theme song, I
mm,
would argue Buffy is following it in the tradition of a show like Murphy Brown. So, for those of you that don't know, Murphy Brown was a show about this female news anchor um, and reporter who was doing all this wonderful work and getting a lot of pushback from the religious right because she dared to have a baby out of wedlock. And this was in the early 90s. But the reason I bring up Murphy Brown is that music was always part of her show. Um, she kind of revitalized Aretha Franklin's version of "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman" because it became like the theme song for her show. Um, and so Buffy really follows in this tradition, and then it continues the tradition of musical being okay on American TV. Because like we've talked about, like I've often said, we have a weird relationship with musicals in pop culture here. Like when I talk about somewhere that's green from Little Shop of Horrors, half the people that respond to me reply with, "Oh, I've seen that Family Guy episode," not realizing Family Guy was literally lifting that whole cloth from the show, or the Shapoopy song from The Music Man. So we have this weird in America, like we really love musicals, but we don't. A large portion of the segment of the population won't allow themselves to love musicals. I would love to see the
mm,
intersection between horror fans and musical theater fans that love this episode. I'd be very curious to see what kind of overlap you get because I think there's enough both musical and gothic elements that you'd have an overlap of people that normally wouldn't hang out together really kind of hang out and vibe with this. I feel like not to mention the Dark Willow storyline is one of the most interesting things to see on television because when you think of like a heel turn for a character, you think of the WWF and wrestling. But what Willow does is essentially a heel turn, but on a scripted TV show,
mm,
um, which is such an interesting way to take a character. And you see little glimpses of it in season 6. And by the time Tara is singing the reprise to Under Your Spell, you've really
mm,
seen how Willow has changed and how much wanting to feel special has corrupted her
mm.
because she didn't want to stand in Buffy's shadow. But she wasn't in Buffy's shadow because she was never created to be a Buffy like character. Um, yeah,
The closest I can think of such a heel turn from one of Buffy's sister shows was I forget which season it was, but in Charmed, Phoebe temporarily becomes the queen of the underworld because she's in love with Cole, who's been taken over by the Source, the big bad of the
yeah.
season. Um, but that lasts all of 1 to 2 episodes as the queen of the underworld, and she never really committed to, like, there's no way she can really be compared to Willow's
Yeah.
um portray, like the performance that Willow has in this season. But that is the closest I can think off the top of my head.
Yeah,
The
Supernatural was always really gun shy about permanently doing anything to their characters.
Oh yes.
So when we talk about Supernatural, if we ever do talk about Supernatural, because I don't think anybody wants to hear me yammer on for an hour and a half about Dusty Hill, um, I there's a really interesting thing that Joss always did with Buffy, where he pushed out what people expected, and I think that's why people liked Buffy and why people resonate with this episode. The only time he ever pulled back was after one of the episodes was supposed to premiere after a very specific school shooting that happened, and he pulled back on
Yeah.
that episode and released it later. Um, but that was earlier in the show's run, and he didn't have quite the cachet. Um, I think there's something really interesting to note that while Sarah Michelle Gellar was Buffy, she was also playing Daphne in Scooby Doo, and she had been on TV for a long, like she had been on Swan's Crossing, which was her doing a
Mm.
soap opera. And so this show was full of professional working actors. I think Nicholas Brendan, who had come to acting from like the Harrison Ford route, where he had been doing like carpentry beforehand. Michelle Trachtenberg had been a student actress since before Harriet the Spy. Anthony Stewart Head was known for theater, and James Marsters was one of the actors that did heavy lifting in Buffy. I would say as much as Spike is not my favorite character, his turn in trying to find a soul for himself after his chip is deactivated is very powerful, and you actually start to see it in Once More with Feeling, how James Marsters' masterful acting is taking the mythology of the hardened, like Louis style interview with a vampire, cold blooded killer, and actually showing a reflection of what it means to not have a soul and to not do things with the conscience. And James Marsters acting in the second half of Buffy when they just let him go is phenomenal. In season 7, when he's essentially being tortured in his mind by the first, and they have this really great scene of him doing like a daredevil thing on a cross and his skin is sizzling, is probably one of the most bittersweet important moments in the Buffyverse, but also just architecturally to the show, one of the most great gothic romantic moments the show does. Because the show is a very romantic show. Buffy is a show about emotion, and it's about the way that we romance other people. And I think that's why it works as a musical episode too, really. So
Mm, indeed. Oh, wow. I feel like I've been through the full musical myself at the moment. It's
it's
been
really good. It's an hour and 8 minutes of television. You'll be happy to see. I'm not actually sure if it's been edited down because it was released as its own disc on a DVD. It's the only episode of Buffy to be released as a singular episode on DVD. So I don't know if that has the actual rest of the 8 minutes on it. But it is the longest episode of Buffy, so it's the best 1 hour and 8 minutes of TV that you could spend. So.
yeah. And hopefully one day they might get the rights sorted out again and people will be able to enjoy this as the midnight flick. Because I'm sure there'll be lots of Buffy fans that would love to have the opportunity to go and see this on the big screen.
I mean, I would do it. Maybe one day. We'll see if Once More with Feeling will be on the big screen once more. We're running out of time here, so I want to thank everyone for listening in. Thank you, Magnus, for hanging in while I basically opine about Buffy for an hour.
That's quite all right. Like, one must regale everyone with what you enjoy. So,
Yes, and we will regale everyone more on the next episode of Everything is Gay, even the straight stuff. Have a great day, everyone.
ta-da! Bye.
Adandi.